The forest swallowed Isolde's ragged breaths as she ran, branches tearing at her arms like skeletal fingers trying to drag her back to the nightmare she'd fled. 3 days without proper rest. 3 days with nothing but stream water and a handful of berries that her churning stomach had rejected within hours. The child growing inside her, barely 3 weeks formed, a flutter of new life she'd only confirmed the morning everything shattered, demanded sustenance she couldn't provide. Her wolf whimpered at the edges of her consciousness, exhausted beyond measure but still vigilant, still scanning the darkness for pursuit. They would come. Corvus would send his hunters the moment he realized she'd slipped past the border guards he'd posted. Her brother had thought of everything else in his meticulous destruction of her life. He wouldn't overlook a loose end as dangerous as a living witness. Keep moving. Keep moving. The baby needs you to keep moving. The thought had become a mantra, pulsing in rhythm with her faltering heartbeat. She pressed a hand to her still flat stomach as she stumbled over a root, catching herself against a rough-barked oak. The skin there felt no different than it had a month ago, but everything had changed. Everything. She could still hear her brother's voice, smooth as poisoned honey, echoing through the great hall of Thornwood Keep as he'd addressed the assembled pack. Our beloved father lies dead by treachery, and the traitor stands before you, my own sister, who thought to steal the alpha title through murder. The gasps, the growls, the faces of wolves she'd known her entire life twisting with hatred as Corvus produced the vial he'd planted in her chambers. The same distinctive purple poison she'd watched him pour into their father's evening wine. She'd been frozen, unable to speak, unable to defend herself as the weight of 100 accusing stares crushed the breath from her lungs. She has always resented father's decision to name me heir, Corvus had continued, his dark eyes gleaming with triumph that only she could recognize. Her jealousy festered into madness, into patricide. Isolde's claws had emerged then, her wolf snarling in desperate denial, but two of Corvus's personal guards had seized her arms before she could lunge. His smile had widened at her struggles, and he'd leaned close enough that only she could hear his whispered words. I told you what would happen if you ever tried to expose me. Now you'll rot in the cells until I decide what entertainment your death might provide. Perhaps I'll let the unmated males draw lots for who gets to break you first. The memory sent ice through her veins even now, even running, even free. She'd believed him. Goddess help her. She'd seen the truth of it in his eyes. The same cold calculation that had let him poison their father over dinner while discussing trade agreements. Corvus didn't make idle threats. He made promises. But he hadn't counted on the servants' passage behind the cell wall. He hadn't remembered that their mother, dead these 12 years, had shown Isolde every hidden route in the keep when she was barely old enough to walk. He'd been so confident in his victory that he'd left only 2 guards on her door. And when she'd slipped through the crumbling stone into the passage, her wolf had guided her through darkness so complete she couldn't see her own hands. Now the borderlands stretched around her, lawless territory between pack holdings where rogues and exiles carved out brutal existences. She'd hoped to cross quickly, to reach the human towns beyond where she might disappear, where she might raise her child far from the politics of wolves and the brother who would never stop hunting her. The child. The child she'd never planned, never expected. Conceived in a single night with a traveling wolf whose name she'd never learned and whose face she could barely remember through the haze of the fertility festival's moon wine. She'd woken alone and thought nothing of it until the nausea started. Until the healer's knowing eyes had confirmed what her wolf already sensed. And now that tiny life was all that kept her moving when her body screamed for her to stop. A branch cracked somewhere to her left. Isolde froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. The sound had been too heavy for a deer, too careless for a hunting predator. Her wolf's ears pricked forward, straining. Laughter. Low and cruel, sliding through the trees like oil. Well, well, What have we found wandering our territory? They emerged from the shadows like nightmares given form. 5 of them, their clothes ragged, their eyes gleaming with the feral hunger of wolves who had abandoned pack bonds and pack laws. Rogues, the worst danger in the borderlands. Wolves who took what they wanted and answered to no alpha. The largest stepped forward, his scarred face splitting into a grin that showed too many teeth. A pretty little Omega, all alone. Running from something, are you, sweetheart? Isolde backed against the oak, her claws extending instinctively. Her wolf surged forward, exhaustion momentarily forgotten in the face of threat. But even her animal half knew the odds. 5 against 1, and she was weakened, half-starved, carrying a life that made her fighting instincts war with every protective urge screaming at her to flee rather than risk injury. Stay back. Her voice came out steadier than she expected. I want no trouble, I'm just passing through. Hear that, boys? She wants no trouble. The rogue's smile widened as the others spread out, flanking her, cutting off escape routes. Neither do we. We just want to make some coin. Pretty Omega like you will fetch a fine price from the right buyer. Some alpha looking for a bedwarmer who won't talk back. The baby. Protect the baby. The thought crystallized everything. They would sell her into slavery, into a fate perhaps worse than what Corvus had planned. Her child would be born in chains, raised in bondage, never knowing freedom or safety or love. Something ancient and fierce rose up in Isolde's chest, not just her wolf, but something deeper, something that spoke of the mother she was becoming. I said, she growled, her voice dropping to something barely human, stay back. The rogue lunged. Isolde moved on instinct, ducking under his grasping arms and driving her claws across his throat in a spray of hot crimson. He gurgled, eyes wide with shock, and collapsed. She didn't stop to watch him fall. She was already spinning, catching the second attacker's wrist and using his momentum to slam him into the oak hard enough to hear bone crack. But there were too many. A third rogue tackled her from behind, driving her to the forest floor. Leaves and dirt filled her mouth as she thrashed, claws raking blindly, catching flesh, drawing screams. Someone stomped on her wrist and she felt something give way with a sickening pop. A howl split the night. Not the rogues. Something else. Something that made every wolf present freeze as primal recognition flooded their hindbrain. Alpha. 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 The weight on Isolde's back vanished as the rogues scrambled away, but too late. Shapes exploded from the tree line. Massive wolves, their coats gleaming silver and gray in the moonlight, their movements coordinated with the precision of a trained military unit. They tore through the remaining rogues with brutal efficiency, and Isolde curled around her stomach, trying to protect the fragile life inside her as blood sprayed and bodies fell. Then silence. She lifted her head, gasping, her injured wrist cradled against her chest. Before her stood a wolf larger than any she'd ever seen, his coat the deep black of a moonless night, his presence pressing against her like a physical weight. She watched, trembling, as he shifted. Bones cracking and reforming, fur receding to reveal bronzed skin and a warrior's scarred body. He was beautiful. Terrifyingly so. Dark hair fell across a face carved from granite and shadow, a jaw that could have been sculpted by artists, lips pressed into a grim line. But his eyes met hers across the blood-soaked clearing. They flashed molten gold, and heat flooded Isolde's chest like someone had poured sunlight directly into her veins. Her wolf surged forward with desperate, keening recognition, straining against her skin as if trying to close the distance between them through sheer will. Her mind screamed that this was impossible, unthinkable, that she was hallucinating from blood loss and exhaustion. But his sharp inhale told her otherwise. His nostrils flared, scenting her through the copper tang of death and the salt of her fear, and something cracked in his expression. something ancient and hungry and yearning. The word tore from his throat like a wound reopening, ragged and raw and devastating in its certainty. Mate. Isolde couldn't breathe. The word hung between them, suspended in the blood-thick air like a blade waiting to fall. Mate. Her wolf howled in response, a sound of such desperate longing that it vibrated through every fiber of her being, drowning out the rational voice screaming that this couldn't be happening, not now, not when everything had already fallen apart. The man, the alpha, because that's what he was. She could feel it in the way the very air seemed to bend around him, took a step forward. His wolves melted back into the shadows, giving him space, and Isolde registered dimly that they moved with the kind of absolute obedience that spoke of years of unwavering loyalty. This wasn't some minor pack leader. This was something else entirely. Don't. The word scraped past her torn throat before she could stop it. She tried to push herself upright, but her injured wrist buckled, sending fresh agony lancing up her arm. A whimper escaped her. Pathetic. Weak. Everything she couldn't afford to be, and she hated herself for it. He froze mid-step, those molten gold eyes tracking the way she cradled her wrist against her chest. Something shifted in his expression, the predatory hunger banking into something else. Something that looked almost like pain. You're hurt. His voice was deeper than she'd expected, rough like gravel wrapped in velvet. It slid down her spine and pooled warmth in her belly, and her wolf pressed forward with such force that Isolde's vision briefly doubled. She gritted her teeth against the sensation, against the pull that seemed to be physically dragging her toward him. I'm fine. The lie tasted like copper on her tongue. I need to go. You need a healer. He crouched slowly, deliberately, making himself smaller even though nothing could truly diminish the sheer presence of him. This close, she could see the scars that crossed his chest, pale lines against bronzed skin that spoke of battles survived. She could smell him too, pine and wood smoke and something darker, something that made her wolf want to roll in his scent until it saturated every inch of her. You need food, rest. You're running on nothing. How would you know what I'm running on? His jaw tightened. Because I can hear your heartbeat struggling. Because your wolf is so exhausted I can feel her trembling from here. Because... He stopped, nostrils flaring again, and this time his eyes widened slightly. The gold flickered, intensified. You're... No, 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 no. Isolde's hand flew to her stomach before she could stop herself, and she watched understanding dawn across his features. Her secret. Her precious, fragile secret, the only thing she had left in this world, and he'd scented it through blood and death and fear in a matter of moments. Please. The word came out broken, and she despised herself for begging but couldn't stop. Please, just let me go. Pretend you never saw me. I can't, I'm not... You don't want me as a mate. Trust me, I'm nothing but trouble, and I'll only bring danger to your door, and... Stop. The command rolled through her like thunder, and her wolf submitted instantly, going belly up in her mind even as Isolde's human half bristled at the authority in his tone. He hadn't raised his voice. He hadn't needed to. The power was simply there, woven into every syllable, and she understood with sudden crystalline clarity exactly who she was looking at. You're the Alpha King. The words fell from her lips like stones. Sebastian Windrider. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, that she'd recognized him. Yes. The Alpha King, ruler of the Windrider territory, the largest pack holding in the eastern reaches, a wolf whose name was spoken in whispers and warnings throughout every pack she'd ever known. They said he'd killed his first challenger at 16. They said he'd united 3 warring packs through sheer force of will and strategic brilliance. They said he was cold, calculating, utterly without mercy. They hadn't mentioned that looking at him would make her feel like her soul was trying to tear itself free from her body to reach him. Then you really don't want me? Isolde forced herself to meet his gaze, even as doing so sent another wave of that impossible warmth cascading through her chest. I'm a traitor. That's what my pack believes. My brother. She choked on the name, on the bitter taste of betrayal. My brother convinced them I murdered our father. I have nothing. No status, no allies, no value. And I'm carrying another wolf's child. So whatever the mate bond is telling you, ignore it. Find someone worthy of a king. Sebastian was silent for a long moment. The clearing seemed to hold its breath. The only sound the drip of blood from nearby bodies and the harsh rasp of Isolde's breathing. Then, slowly, deliberately, he extended his hand. Come with me. Did you not hear? I heard. His voice gentled, though it lost none of its underlying steel. I heard that you're alone, injured, pregnant, and fleeing from someone who wants you dead. I heard that you killed 2 of these rogues before my wolves arrived. His gaze flicked to the bodies, something like respect kindling in those golden depths. I heard that you fought to protect yourself and your child even when you had nothing left to fight with. And I heard my wolf recognize you as his mate, which means the goddess herself has declared you worthy. He paused, his extended hand unwavering. So I will ask you again. Come with me. And if I refuse? Then I will have my wolves escort you to the human towns as you clearly intended, and I will spend the rest of my very long life wondering what I could have had. The words came out rough, almost against his will. But I won't force you. I won't ever force you. Whatever else you believe about me, believe that. Isolde stared at his hand. Calloused, strong, scarred across the knuckles. A warrior's hand, a killer's hand. But also steady, patient, offering without demanding. Her wolf whined, pressing against her consciousness with desperate hope, and the child in her belly, too small to be felt, too new to be real, seemed to pulse with something that might have been agreement. She thought of Corvus, of his cold eyes and colder promises, of the cell waiting for her if she was ever caught, of raising a baby in human towns where she'd have to hide her nature, suppress her wolf, pretend to be something she wasn't for the rest of her life. She thought of the way Sebastian had frozen when she'd told him to stop, the way he'd made himself smaller to seem less threatening, the way he was still crouched there, hand extended, waiting for her choice as if it mattered more than his own desires. Isolde reached out and took his hand. The contact was electric, sending shockwaves rippling up her arm and into her chest. Her wolf surged forward with a sound of pure relief, and she felt an answering rumble from Sebastian, not quite a growl, not quite a purr, something in between that vibrated through their joined hands. His fingers closed around hers, warm and impossibly gentle, and when he helped her to her feet, he moved slowly, carefully, as if she were made of glass. My wolves will carry you, he said. You shouldn't walk on that wrist. I can walk. I know you can. His thumb traced a small circle on the back of her hand before he seemed to catch himself and stopped. But you don't have to. Something in Isolde's chest cracked just a little, just enough to let in a sliver of light. She woke in silk. For a disorienting moment, Isolde thought she was back in Thornwood Keep, in her chambers, in the life that had been ripped away from her. But the scent was wrong, not the familiar herbs and old stone of home, but something cleaner, sharper. Pine and wood smoke and that dark, enticing undertone that her wolf immediately identified and yearned toward. Him. Her eyes flew open. The room was larger than her entire quarters at Thornwood had been, dominated by a massive bed draped in silver and deep blue. Moonlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating walls hung with tapestries depicting wolves running through snow-covered forests. A fire crackled in a stone hearth, and before it, Sebastian sat in a chair across the room watching her, not touching her, not on the bed, not even close enough to reach her without rising. He'd positioned himself as far from her as he could while still being present, and when he saw she was awake, he didn't move. He simply watched, those gold-touched eyes gleaming in the firelight. How long? Isolde's voice came out rusty with sleep. 6 hours. The healer said you needed rest more than anything else. She set your wrist while you were unconscious. He nodded toward her arm, and Isolde realized it had been wrapped in careful bandages, the pain dulled to a manageable throb. She also confirmed the pregnancy. 8 weeks now. 8 weeks. Isolde's heart stuttered. She'd thought 3 weeks, maybe 4. But of course, wolf pregnancies progress differently, and she'd been so focused on survival that she hadn't counted properly. You've been sitting there the whole time? Yes. Why? Something flickered across his features. Vulnerability, quickly masked. Because I wasn't sure if you'd still be here when you woke. And I needed to make sure you knew you were safe, that no one touched you while you slept, that you could leave if you wanted to, and no one would stop you. But that He stopped, jaw working. I wanted to be here. Isolde stared at him. This was the Alpha King, the wolf whose name made lesser wolves tremble. And he'd spent 6 hours sitting vigil in a chair, watching over her sleep, making sure she felt safe. He could have touched me. He could have claimed me. He could have done anything he wanted while I was unconscious, and I couldn't have stopped him. But he hadn't. He'd sat across the room like a guardian, like a protector, and now he was looking at her like she was something precious rather than something broken. There's food. Sebastian rose slowly, still moving with that deliberate care that made him seem less threatening despite his size. He crossed to a table near the hearth and lifted a covered tray, bringing it to set on the bed beside her. When he lifted the cover, the scent of warm bread and honey and some kind of rich meat stew hit Isolde's nose, and her stomach cramped with violent hunger. Eat. No one will harm you here. I swear it on my blood. The oath startled her. Wolves didn't offer blood oaths lightly. They were binding, sacred. Breaking them meant consequences that went beyond mere honor. She searched his face for deception, for the cold calculation everyone said he possessed, but found only earnest intensity. Why? The question encompassed everything. Why help her? Why claim her? Why offer blood oaths to a disgraced Omega carrying another wolf's child? Sebastian was quiet for a moment. Then he sat on the edge of the bed, still not touching her, still leaving space, and his eyes dropped to where her hand rested on her bandaged wrist. I've ruled for 15 years, he said softly. I've fought wars, made alliances, built my territory into something that will last generations, and in all that time, I never felt anything when I looked at the wolves presented to me as potential mates. They were all adequate, beautiful, some of them accomplished, but there was no recognition, no fire. He looked up, and his eyes blazed gold. Then I saw you fighting rogues in a blood-soaked clearing with a broken blade, protecting something you wouldn't let them take, and my wolf nearly tore free of my skin trying to reach you. That's why. Isolde swallowed hard. I'm not what you think I am. I know exactly what you are. His voice dropped, roughened. You're mine. The rest, we'll figure out together. He left her then, moving to the door with a final glance over his shoulder that made her wolf whine with the urge to call him back. When he was gone, Isolde sat alone in the massive bed, surrounded by silk and warmth and safety she hadn't known in weeks. She ate every bite of food on the tray, her hands trembling. And when she finally slept again, her wolf curled around the ember of warmth in her chest that felt dangerously like hope. The whispers started by the second day. Isolde hadn't left the room Sebastian had given her, insisted she stay in until the healer cleared her, but wolves talked, and sound carried. She caught fragments through half-open doors and thin walls. Disgraced Omega. Another male's bastard. The king has lost his mind. She'd expected it. That didn't make it hurt less. On the third day, the whispers came with teeth. Isolde had finally ventured to the great hall, her wolf too restless to stay confined any longer. Sebastian was in council meetings, and she thought she might explore, learn the layout of this place that was supposed to be her new home. She'd barely made it to the hall's entrance when a cluster of richly dressed wolves blocked her path. Well? The woman at their center was stunning, all dark hair and sharp cheekbones and a smile like a blade's edge. The king's new charity case. How quaint. Isolde's wolf bristled, but she forced herself to remain calm. I'm just looking for the kitchens. Kitchens? How appropriate. Perhaps that's where you belong. The woman, an advisor, Isolde guessed, based on her bearing, stepped closer, her scent marking her as a high-ranking beta. Tell me, did you plan this? Find a way to cross the king's path at just the right moment, covered in blood and desperation? It's quite the performance. I didn't plan anything. No? Then how fortunate for you that rogues just happened to attack you within range of the king's patrol. How convenient that the Alpha King himself happened to be present for your rescue. Isolde's hands curled into fists at her sides. Believe what you want. I don't need to justify myself to you. The woman's smile sharpened. You're right. You don't need to justify yourself to me. But you will need to justify yourself to the pack when they learn their king intends to make a pregnant traitor his Luna, when they discover the Alpha King has accepted another wolf's bastard as his heir. Enough. The word cracked through the hall like a whip, and every wolf present flinched. Isolde turned to find Sebastian striding toward them, his face carved from ice, his eyes blazing with molten fury. The council members behind him stumbled to keep up, their expressions ranging from shock to barely concealed glee at the drama unfolding. My king! The dark-haired woman began, her composure flickering. Lady Vashti. Sebastian's voice was deadly calm, more frightening than any roar. Did I just hear you question my mate's right to be here? Did I hear you call the child she carries a bastard? Lady Vashti's face drained of color. The wolves around her scattered like leaves before a storm, suddenly finding elsewhere to be. She stood alone now, facing an Alpha King whose control seemed to be hanging by a thread. She carries my heir now. Sebastian's words echoed through the hall, pitched to carry, meant to be heard by every wolf within range. Any who question my Luna questions me. Any who insults her insults me. Any who threatens her threatens my blood. He stepped closer to Lady Vashti, and though she was tall, she seemed to shrink before him. Is there something you wish to say to my mate, Vashti? An apology, perhaps? The woman's throat worked. Her gaze flickered to Isolde, hatred, quickly masked, and then back to Sebastian. I apologize, I spoke out of turn. You spoke treason. Sebastian's voice dropped further, and Isolde felt the words resonate in her bones. Leave my sight. We'll discuss your future at court when I've decided whether you have one. Lady Vashti fled. Sebastian turned to Isolde, and the fury in his expression melted into something softer. Concern, perhaps, or apology. I'm sorry. I should have anticipated this. Should have warned the court before you had to face them. You didn't have to do that. Isolde's voice came out steadier than she felt. Defend me like that. It will only make them hate me more. Let them hate. His hand came up, hesitated, then gently tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. The touch sent warmth cascading through her, and she swayed toward him before she could stop herself. They don't need to love you. They need to respect you. And they will in time, when they see what I already know. What's that? His lips curved into the first real smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, made him look younger, less burdened by the weight of a crown. That you're worth more than the whole lot of them combined. That the goddess knew exactly what she was doing when she gave you to me. He left her then, returning to his council with a promise to join her for dinner. Isolde stood in the empty hall, heart pounding, her hand pressed to her barely rounded belly. She carries my heir now. He didn't know the truth, didn't know whose child she actually carried, didn't know the circumstances of conception. And yet, he'd claimed them both without hesitation, had defended her before his entire court, had looked at her like she was precious rather than problematic. In the shadows of a nearby doorway, Isolde's wolf caught a familiar scent. Fresh. Recent. Someone had been listening. She'd deal with that later. Right now, she had something more important to focus on. For the first time since her father's death, the walls around her heart began, just slightly, to crumble. The scent lingered in her nostrils long after she'd left the great hall. Pine and frost, overlaid with something sharper. Ambition, perhaps, or calculation. Whoever had been listening from those shadows had wanted to hear every word of Sebastian's declaration, every syllable of Lady Vashti's humiliation. Isolde made her way back to her chambers slowly, her injured wrist throbbing despite the healer's careful work. The corridors of Windrider Keep were nothing like the cramped stone passages of Thornwood. Here, everything sprawled with deliberate grandeur, vaulted ceilings that seemed to touch the sky, windows that caught the afternoon light and scattered it across marble floors in patterns of gold and amber. Beautiful. Foreign. A gilded cage was still a cage, no matter how lovely its bars. She'd nearly reached her door when the scent hit her again. Stronger this time. Closer. Sister! Isolde's blood turned to ice. She spun, her claws extending on instinct, her wolf surging forward with a snarl that vibrated through her entire body. Corvus stood at the end of the corridor, dressed in the formal attire of an ambassador. Deep green velvet trimmed with silver, their father's sigil embroidered over his heart like he had any right to wear it. His dark hair was slicked back from his angular face, his pale eyes glittering with malicious amusement. "You look well," he continued, taking a step closer. "Better than I expected, given the circumstances. Running agrees with you. Stay back." Her voice came out raw, scraped over gravel and broken glass. "Stay away from me." Is that any way to greet family? Corvus spread his hands in a mockery of peace. "I've come such a long way, through such dangerous territory, all to bring my troubled sister home before she embarrasses our bloodline further." The lie rolled off his tongue like honey, smooth and sweet and poisonous. Isolde's stomach churned. 3 weeks ago, she'd watched this man stand over their father's cooling body with a smile on his face. 3 weeks ago, she'd fled through passages their mother had shown her, the purple vial he'd planted in her chambers already being discovered by his loyal guards. "How did you get in here?" "I'm an ambassador." Corvus examined his nails with affected boredom. "Here to negotiate a trade agreement between our territories. The Alpha King himself granted me safe passage." Funny, isn't it? How quickly doors open when you wear a crown. Their father's crown. Stolen over a dying breath, claimed through patricide and betrayal. Isolde's claws dug into her palms hard enough to draw blood. "Sebastian will never let you take me." Sebastian. Corvus savored the name like fine wine. "You're on intimate terms with the Alpha King already? My. You work fast, little sister. Though I suppose you always did have a talent for spreading your legs when opportunity presented itself." The words hit like physical blows. Isolde thought of the fertility festival, the moon wine clouding her judgment, waking alone in tangled sheets with no memory of the wolf who'd touched her. Shame coiled hot and tight in her belly. "What do you want, Corvus?" "To help you." He stepped closer and she stepped back, her spine pressing against the cold stone wall. "To offer you a chance to come home with your dignity intact. Confess to father's murder publicly. Say you did it in a moment of madness, that you weren't in your right mind. and I'll ensure you're treated mercifully. A quiet life in the country somewhere, comfortable, safe. I didn't kill him. The words tore from her throat. You know I didn't kill him. You're the one who... Careful. Corvus's eyes hardened, all pretense of warmth evaporating. You're making accusations you can't prove, sister. And if you persist in this delusion, I'll have no choice but to tell the Alpha King certain uncomfortable truths about your condition. Isolde's hand moved to her belly before she could stop herself. Corvus's gaze tracked the movement, his smile widening. Oh yes, I know about the child. I know it's not his. It can't be, given the timeline. And I know exactly how it came to be. That little festival you attended? The wolf who bedded you? He leaned in close enough that she could smell the wine on his breath, the rot beneath his expensive cologne. He was one of mine. A test, to see just how easily my virtuous sister could be corrupted. The answer, it seems, was very. Horror crept through her veins like frost. You're lying. Am I? I have witnesses, Isolde. I have the wolf himself, ready to testify that you threw yourself at him, begged him to take you. How do you think your precious Alpha King will react when he learns his mate conceived another wolf's bastard through shameful wantonness rather than unfortunate circumstance? The corridor seemed to spin around her. Isolde pressed her bandaged wrist against the wall, fighting for balance, fighting against the nausea rising in her throat. He won't believe you. Won't he? I've already spoken to a healer here. Lovely woman. Very amenable to financial persuasion. She'll confirm the pregnancy is incompatible with any recent activities between you and the king. The math simply doesn't work, sister. And when the court learns you've been deceiving him from the start? Corvus shrugged elegantly. Even the mate bond can't survive that kind of betrayal. Isolde's wolf howled with rage, pressing against her skin, demanding to be released, to tear out her brother's lying throat. But she was exhausted and injured and outnumbered in ways that went beyond simple numbers. Corvus had always been the schemer, the planner, the one who saw 10 moves ahead while she struggled to see one. Confess, he said softly. Come home. Or I'll destroy everything you're trying to build here, and I'll enjoy every moment of it. He walked away before she could respond, his footsteps echoing on the marble floor. Isolde slid down the wall until she was sitting on the cold stone, her arms wrapped around her belly, trembling so hard her teeth chattered. The wolf who bedded you was one of mine. She didn't know if it was true. The moon wine had clouded everything, left only fragments, warmth and pressure and pleasure that had felt like something more than mere physical release. But Corvus was a masterful liar, and he'd had weeks to prepare this trap while she'd been running for her life. The shadows in the corridor seemed to deepen, pressing in around her. Isolde closed her eyes and focused on breathing, on the tiny flutter of life in her womb, on the ember of the mate bond that still burned steady and warm in her chest despite everything. She needed to tell Sebastian, needed to confess everything before Corvus could twist the truth beyond recognition. But what if he didn't believe her? Dinner that night was an exercise in pretense. Isolde sat across from Sebastian in his private chambers, picking at food she couldn't taste, forcing smiles she didn't feel. The room was warm, lit by a crackling fire that cast dancing shadows across the tapestried walls, and Sebastian had clearly taken pains to make it comfortable. Fresh flowers on the table, her favorite dishes. How had he learned her preferences so quickly? Wine that she didn't touch because of the child. You're quiet tonight. Sebastian's voice cut through her spiraling thoughts. Quieter than usual, I mean. Which is saying something. Isolde looked up to find him watching her with those golden eyes that seemed to see straight through every wall she'd ever built. He'd changed from his formal attire into something simpler, a loose linen shirt that showed the scars crossing his chest, dark trousers that emphasized the powerful lines of his legs. Even relaxed, he radiated authority, power. the kind of strength that could protect or destroy with equal ease. I met someone today, she said carefully. After you left. Sebastian's expression sharpened. Who? An ambassador from Thornwood. She couldn't bring herself to say his name. My brother. Corvus. The temperature in the room seemed to drop several degrees. Sebastian's hand stilled on his wine glass, his knuckles whitening around the stem. He's here? In my territory? He arrived this afternoon, apparently. You granted him safe passage for trade negotiations. I granted passage to the Thornwood delegation. Sebastian's voice had gone low and dangerous. I didn't know he would be among them. My people should have warned me the moment he set foot across my borders. He found me alone in the corridor. Isolde's voice wavered despite her best efforts. He wants me to confess to our father's murder publicly, to come home with him. Sebastian was on his feet before she finished speaking, prowling toward her with predatory grace. He knelt beside her chair, taking her hands in his, careful of her injured wrist, and turned her to face him. Look at me. When she met his eyes, she found fury there, burning bright and hot, but none of it directed at her. Tell me exactly what he said. Every word. So she did. Almost every word. She told him about Corvus's demand for a public confession, about his threat to reveal certain truths about her pregnancy, about the healer he claimed to have bribed. She told him about the planted evidence, the witnesses standing ready to testify against her. She didn't tell him about the fertility festival, about the wolf Corvus claimed had been his creature all along. That truth stuck in her throat like a fishbone, too sharp to swallow, too dangerous to spit out. Sebastian listened in silence, his thumbs tracing slow circles on the backs of her hands. When she finished, he exhaled slowly, a sound like a storm passing. He's trying to break you before you can settle here, before the court accepts you as my Luna. His jaw tightened. Before our bond can fully form. Can he do it? The question came out barely above a whisper. Can he destroy what we're building? Only if I let him. Sebastian's hands tightened on hers. Isolde, I need you to trust me. I know that's asking a great deal, given everything you've been through. But I need you to believe that I will not let your brother take you anywhere. I will not let him spread his poison through my court. And I will not. His voice cracked. Just slightly. I will not abandon you because of lies told by a man who murdered his own father. The words washed over her like warm water, loosening muscles she hadn't realized she'd been clenching. Isolde sagged forward, and Sebastian caught her, pulling her from the chair into his arms. He was so warm, so solid. She pressed her face against his shoulder and breathed in his scent, pine and winter frost and something darker, richer, like old wood and burning embers. Her wolf settled at the contact, a low purr building in her chest that she couldn't quite suppress. I don't understand, she murmured against his shirt. Why you're doing this? Any of this? I'm a stranger, a refugee. I bring nothing but trouble to your door. You bring yourself. His voice rumbled through his chest, vibrating against her cheek. That's enough. That's more than enough. The bond isn't the only reason I'm protecting you. He pulled back just enough to meet her eyes. Isolde, I've ruled for 15 years. I've had offers from every noble family on the continent, daughters and sisters and cousins, all eager to share my crown and my bed. I've refused them all because none of them made me feel anything. And then I found you in that clearing, covered in blood and fighting like a wildcat, and something inside me that I thought had died a long time ago woke up. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing away a tear she hadn't realized she'd shed. The bond recognized what was already there. He continued softly, a connection that has nothing to do with wolf magic and everything to do with who you are. Fierce, brave, unbroken despite everything the world has thrown at you. His lips curved into that rare, devastating smile, How could I not want to protect that? How could I not fight for it? Isolde's heart stuttered in her chest. The walls she'd been building for weeks. For years, really. Ever since her mother died and left her alone in a keep full of wolves who saw her as nothing but a means to an end, those walls trembled and cracked and began to crumble in earnest. She kissed him. It wasn't planned. It wasn't calculated. One moment she was looking into his golden eyes, and the next her lips were pressed against his, tentative and trembling and desperate all at once. Sebastian froze for a heartbeat. Then his arms tightened around her and he kissed her back with a hunger that stole her breath. Heat flooded through the bond, golden and fierce, and Isolde's wolf sang with joy. The next 3 days passed in a strange twilight between hope and terror. Sebastian assigned guards to Isolde at all hours. Wolves loyal only to him, he assured her, immune to bribery and threats alike. He kept Corvus occupied with endless negotiations, making sure the Thornwood delegation had no opportunity to approach Isolde again. And every evening he joined her for dinner in his private chambers, their conversations ranging from trivial to profound, their kisses growing longer and deeper as the bond between them strengthened. But Corvus was patient. Corvus was always patient. On the fourth morning, Isolde woke to screaming. She bolted upright in bed, her heart hammering, her wolf instantly alert. The screaming continued, a high, keening wail that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Isolde threw on a robe and ran into the corridor, where she nearly collided with one of her guards. "What's happening?" The guard's face was pale, his eyes wide with shock. "My lady, you should stay in your chambers. What's happening?" Before he could answer, Sebastian appeared at the end of the corridor, his face carved from ice, his eyes blazing with fury so intense it made Isolde's wolf cower. "He's made his move," Sebastian said, his voice barely recognizable. "Your brother has accused you of witchcraft. He claims you've been using dark magic to enchant me, to cloud my judgment and turn me against my own people." The world tilted beneath Isolde's feet. "That's insane. I don't have any magic, He has evidence." Sebastian's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "Documents, witnesses, a confession from a healer who claims you forced her to lie about your pregnancy. He's demanding a trial before the full court. If he wins, the old laws require your execution." Isolde's knees buckled. Sebastian caught her before she could fall, pulling her against his chest, but even his warmth couldn't stop the cold spreading through her veins. "I didn't do anything," she whispered. "Sebastian, I swear to you, I didn't." "I know." His voice was fierce, absolute. "I know you didn't, but he's invoked laws older than my kingship, laws I cannot simply overrule. There will be a trial." His arms tightened around her. "And we will win it. Together." In the distance, the screaming finally stopped. In its place came something worse, the steady drumbeat of war drums calling the pack to witness. Corvus had made his move. Now Isolde would have to make hers. The great hall had transformed into a court of judgment. Torches blazed in iron sconces along the walls, casting harsh shadows that made the assembled wolves look like specters gathered to witness an execution. Isolde stood at the center of it all, her guards flanking her but unable to touch her, unable to interfere with the ancient rites Corvus had invoked. Sebastian sat on his throne, his face a mask of barely contained fury. Protocol demanded he remain impartial until evidence was presented, demanded he sit apart from her when every line of his body screamed to stand at her side. The bond between them pulsed with his anger, his fear, his desperate need to protect her, but also his trust, his absolute faith that she would find a way through this. Corvus stood at the front of the hall, resplendent in the colors of Thornwood, their father's crown gleaming on his brow. He looked every inch the wronged alpha, the grieving son seeking justice for his murdered father. "The accused stands before you," Corvus announced, his voice ringing through the hall with practiced authority. Isolde of Thornwood, who murdered our father in cold blood, who fled justice like the coward she is, and who has now ensnared your Alpha King with dark magic, bending his will to her own twisted purposes. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Isolde felt their eyes on her, some hostile, some uncertain, some pitying. Lady Vashti stood near the back, her expression unreadable. I have brought evidence of her crimes. Corvus gestured, and a woman was led forward, the healer who had examined Isolde upon her arrival. The woman's eyes were downcast, her shoulders hunched with shame or fear. This healer will testify that Isolde Thornwood carries a child conceived through dark ritual, a binding that allows her to control any wolf who touches her. The healer's voice trembled as she spoke rehearsed words about examinations that never happened, magic she'd supposedly detected. Isolde's stomach churned with nausea that had nothing to do with her pregnancy. The lies were so elaborate, so carefully constructed. Corvus had been planning this for far longer than 3 days. Furthermore, Corvus continued, producing a sheaf of documents, I have correspondence proving that Isolde has been in contact with enemies of the Windrider pack, plotting to assassinate the Alpha King once her hold over him was complete. Those are forgeries, Isolde said, her voice cutting through the murmurs. Just like the poison vial you planted in my chambers. Just like every piece of evidence you've manufactured to hide your own crimes. Corvus's smile was a blade wrapped in silk. You see how she denies everything? How she turns accusations back on those who seek only justice? This is the mark of her enchantment. She has an answer for every truth, a lie for every fact. Sebastian's hands gripped the arms of his throne, his knuckles white. The accused has the right to defend herself, he said, his voice strained with the effort of remaining impartial. What say you, Isolde of Thornwood? Isolde looked at her brother, really looked at him, seeing not the polished Alpha but the boy who had pulled her hair when they were children, who had whispered cruel things in her ear when no one else could hear, who had smiled at their father's funeral while poison still lingered on his hands. She had spent her whole life running from him, running from his cruelty, his manipulations, his cold and calculating hatred. She had run from Thornwood Keep, run through the borderlands, run until she'd collapsed in a blood-soaked clearing and found something she'd never expected to find. A mate, a home, a reason to stop running. The realization crystallized in her chest like ice forming over still water. She could keep running. She could let Corvus's lies bury her, let the court's judgment fall, let Sebastian fight a battle that wasn't his to fight. Or she could stand. She could speak. She could show them all the truth that Corvus had tried so hard to bury. Something stirred in Isolde's blood. Not her wolf, but something older. Something that had slumbered in her mother's bloodline for generations, waiting for a moment of desperate need to surface. Truth showing her mother had called it in whispered stories. The ability to project memories, to make others see what had really happened. It was rare. It was dangerous. It could burn out the mind of anyone foolish enough to attempt it without proper training. Isolde had no training. She had only the memory of her mother's voice explaining the gift and the desperate need to save everything she had found. I have no evidence, she said, her voice steady despite the terror clawing at her throat. I have no witnesses who haven't been bribed or threatened. I have nothing but my word and my blood. She raised her injured wrist, the one that had only just begun to heal. With her other hand, she extended her claws. Isolde, no! Sebastian half rose from his throne, alarm flooding through the bond. I am no traitor, Isolde declared, her voice ringing through the hall. My brother wears the crown he stole over our father's dying body, and I will prove it. With my blood, with my truth, with everything I have. She drew her claws across her palm. The pain was nothing compared to what came next. Power surged up from somewhere deep inside her, ancient and terrible, tearing through her veins like liquid fire. Her vision went white, then red, then fractured into 1,000 pieces as the memories she'd tried so hard to bury came roaring to the surface. The great hall vanished. In its place, the assembled wolves saw what Isolde saw, what Isolde had witnessed 3 weeks ago, the night her world shattered. Corvus, standing over their father's chair. A vial of purple liquid in his hand, distinctive and damning. The casual way he'd poured it into the wine, humming softly under his breath as though this were just another task to complete before dinner. Their father's confused expression as the first tremors began, his hand reaching for his throat as his airway constricted, the foam that gathered at the corners of his mouth as he convulsed, and Corvus, watching, smiling, waiting. The memories shifted. Isolde's chambers, her brother's guards forcing their way inside. The vial, the same distinctive purple, pressed into her hands before she could react. Corvus's voice, smooth and practiced, calling for the household to witness the evidence of her treachery. Another shift. The cells beneath Thornwood Keep, Corvus's whispered threats, the promise of horrors that made bile rise in Isolde's throat even now. And finally, the corridor, just days ago. Corvus's face as he leaned close, his breath hot against her ear, his words poison of a different kind. Confess, or I'll destroy everything you've built. The child in your belly will be born in chains, if I let it be born at all. The vision shattered. Isolde collapsed to her knees, her body convulsing as the power receded like a tide going out. Every nerve ending screamed with agony, her blood feeling like it had turned to acid in her veins. She could barely see, barely breathe. But she could hear. She could hear the shocked silence that had fallen over the court. She could hear Corvus's ragged breathing, his careful mask finally cracking. Lies, he spat, but his voice shook. She's twisted your minds with her witchcraft, shown you false visions. My lady. Sebastian's voice cut through everything, sharp as a blade. He was no longer on his throne. He was beside her, his arms around her, his warmth flooding through the bond and anchoring her to consciousness. My lady, can you stand? Isolde forced her eyes open. The world swam in shades of gray and gold, but she could see the faces of the assembled wolves, shock and horror, and dawning understanding written across their features. She could see Lady Vashti, hand pressed to her mouth, tears tracking down her sharp cheekbones. And she could see Corvus, his composure crumbling as he backed toward the doors. I am no traitor, Isolde repeated, forcing the words past lips that felt numb and clumsy. I am no witch. I am Isolde of Thornwood, daughter of Alpha Thornwood, and I have just shown you the truth that my brother murdered to hide. The great hall erupted. Wolves surged forward, some toward Corvus, others calling for order. Sebastian's guards moved to intercept, their training overriding their shock. But Sebastian was faster. He was already moving, crossing the space between Isolde and her brother with predatory grace, his eyes blazing molten gold, his claws extending as he shifted partially into something between man and wolf. Corvus tried to run. He made it 3 steps before Sebastian's hand closed around his throat, slamming him against the stone wall with enough force to crack the mortar. You poisoned your own father, Sebastian snarled, his voice barely human. You hunted your pregnant sister like prey. You came into my territory and tried to destroy my mate with lies. Corvus's carefully constructed facade finally shattered. Gone was the smooth diplomat, the grieving son, the wronged alpha. In his place was the monster Isolde had always known lurked beneath the surface, petulant and vicious and desperately afraid. She's nothing, Corvus spat, clawing at Sebastian's grip, an Omega whore carrying bastard spawn. I should have killed her years ago, but father always protected his precious little girl. She doesn't deserve the power she could bring you. She doesn't deserve anything. She is my mate." Sebastian's voice dropped to deadly calm, each word precise and final. "My Luna, the mother of my heir, and you die knowing that she destroyed you with nothing but truth." His claws tore out Corvus's throat in a single savage motion. Blood sprayed across the stone, hot and copper bright. Corvus's eyes went wide, then empty, and his body crumpled to the floor like a puppet with cut strings. The crown their father had worn, the crown Corvus had stolen, rolled across the flagstones and came to rest at Isolde's knees. She stared at it, uncomprehending. Grief and relief tangled in her chest, so intertwined she couldn't separate them. This was her brother, her blood. The boy who had pushed her into mud puddles and blamed her for his own mischief, who had grown into a man capable of murdering their father and hunting her across territories. She should feel something more. She should feel less. But all she felt was Sebastian's arms around her as the court fell silent, his heartbeat steady against her back, his presence an anchor in the chaos. "It's over," he murmured against her hair. "Isolde, it's over." She closed her eyes and let herself believe him. The hours that followed passed in a blur. The court recognized the truth of Isolde's vision, acknowledging Corvus's crimes and Sebastian's right to execute him under Alpha law. The bribed healer was taken into custody, sobbing her confession. Messages were dispatched to Thornwood, informing the pack of their false Alpha's crimes and death, but Isolde barely registered any of it. She was exhausted beyond measure, her body still trembling from the power she'd channeled. Sebastian carried her to his chambers himself, ignoring the protests of his advisors who wanted statements and decisions and all the endless details that ruling required. "Later," he told them, his voice brooking no argument. "Everything else can wait until tomorrow. Tonight, she needs rest." Tonight, she needed him. He laid her on the great bed, then moved to leave, to give her space, she realized, even now trying to respect boundaries she no longer wanted. "Stay," she whispered, reaching for him. "Please." Sebastian turned, something raw and wondering in his expression. Slowly, as though approaching a wounded animal, he returned to the bed. He stretched out beside her, close enough to touch, but not quite touching, letting her choose the distance between them. Isolde chose none. She pressed against him, burying her face in his chest, breathing in his scent until it filled her lungs and settled her racing heart. His arms came around her, careful and reverent, holding her like she was something precious. "You could have died," he murmured, his voice rough. The truth showing. You had no training, no preparation. It could have burned you out. You could have... "I know." She looked up at him, meeting those golden eyes that had become the center of her world. "But I couldn't let him win. I couldn't let him take this from us. From me. Isolde." Her name on his lips was a prayer, a promise, a claim. His hand came up to cup her cheek, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. "I've never, in all my years, I've never seen anyone fight like that. Never seen anyone choose so fiercely. You stood before the entire court and bled for truth. And I..." His voice cracked. The Alpha King, the man who had united warring packs and killed his first challenger at 16, broke apart in her arms like he was the fragile one. "I love you," he said, "not because of the bond, not because of fate, because you are the bravest, most stubborn, most incredible woman I have ever known, and I would burn the world to ash if it meant keeping you safe." Isolde kissed him. This time there was no hesitation, no uncertainty, only the fierce, desperate need to claim and be claimed, to seal the bond that had been building since the moment their eyes met across a blood-soaked clearing. Sebastian groaned against her mouth, pulling her closer, his hands sliding into her hair with a gentleness that belied their strength. The kiss deepened, heat flooding through the bond until Isolde couldn't tell where she ended and he began. Then he pulled back, just slightly, his breath ragged against her lips. "Are you sure?" The question was barely a whisper, thick with need and desperate hope. "We don't have to. If you need time. I've been running my whole life." Isolde held his gaze, letting him see everything she felt, the fear and the hope and the bone-deep certainty that this was right. "I'm done running. I want to be yours, Sebastian. Truly yours. And I want you to be mine." Something shifted in his expression. The careful control he'd been maintaining since the moment he found her shattered, replaced by raw, primal hunger that made her wolf rise up in answer. He bared his throat to her. The gesture stole her breath. An alpha king, one of the most powerful wolves in existence, offering his vulnerability to her, offering his submission, offering everything. Isolde's wolf surged against her skin, and she didn't fight it. She leaned forward, pressing her lips to the pulse point at his throat, feeling his heartbeat quicken beneath her mouth. She kissed her way along the strong column of his neck, his scent flooding her senses, her body knowing what to do even if her mind wasn't quite certain. When her teeth grazed the junction of his neck and shoulder, Sebastian shuddered. "Please," he breathed. The word was wrecked. "Isolde, please." She bit down. His blood flooded her mouth, rich and dark and his, and the bond between them ripped open like a dam breaking. Sensation poured through her. His desire, his devotion, his centuries of loneliness giving way to desperate, overwhelming love. She felt what he felt. The rightness of this moment. The completion of something he'd been waiting for his entire life. Sebastian cried out, his hands fisting in her hair, but he held perfectly still as she claimed him. As she marked him as hers in the most permanent way a wolf could be marked. When she finally pulled back, blood staining her lips, he was staring at her with golden eyes gone wide and wild. A raw red bite mark gleamed at his shoulder, already beginning to scar over, her mark, her claim. "Mine," she whispered, and the word felt like coming home. "Yours," he agreed, his voice rough. "Always, always." Then he moved. He was gentle, impossibly gentle, but there was nothing hesitant about the way he rolled her beneath him. His mouth found her throat, kissing and licking and tasting, working his way toward the junction where her neck met her shoulder, where a claiming mark belonged. "I have wanted this," he breathed against her skin, "since the moment I saw you." His teeth scraped her pulse point, and Isolde gasped as warmth flooded through her. Her wolf was keening with anticipation, every nerve ending alight with need. "Yes," she managed. "Sebastian, yes." He bit her. Pain lanced through her, sharp and bright. And then it transformed, blooming into pleasure so intense it stole her breath. Warmth flooded through the bond, golden and fierce, and she felt his mark take hold. Felt his presence settle into the deepest part of her soul, a constant and unwavering presence that she would carry for the rest of her life. Images cascaded through her mind, his memories, his emotions, his very self pouring into her through the bond. She saw his first kill at 16, terrified and defiant. She saw his years of lonely rule, surrounded by wolves who feared him and desired his power but never saw him. She saw the moment he found her in the clearing, the world tilting on its axis as everything he thought he knew rearranged itself around her presence. And she felt his love, deep and vast and unconditional, wrapping around her like armor, like home, like everything she'd been searching for, without knowing she was searching. Sebastian released her throat, pressing his forehead to hers, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Mine," he growled, the word vibrating against her skin. "Yours," she whispered back. "Mate." They held each other as the bond settled, their heartbeats slowly sinking, their wolves curling together in contentment. The world outside continued, advisors waiting, messages to send, a pack to lead, but in this moment there was only them. Two wolves, finally complete, finally home. 2 months later, Isolde stood on the balcony of Windrider Keep, watching the sunrise paint the mountains gold and rose. Her hand rested on her belly, now rounded enough to show beneath her gown. The child within had begun to move, tiny flutters that made her smile every time. Sebastian's arms wrapped around her from behind, his chin resting on her shoulder, his hands joining hers over their growing child. "The Thornwood delegation arrives tomorrow," he murmured. "They've formally pledged their fealty. Your father's pack is yours now. Yours to lead, yours to rebuild." Isolde leaned back against his warmth. The pack that had believed Corvus's lies, that had watched her be dragged to the cells, that had accepted her brother's false crown, they had sent envoys begging forgiveness, recognizing her as their rightful alpha, the true heir to their territory. She hadn't decided yet whether to accept, whether she could face the halls where her father had died, the chambers where she'd been imprisoned, the great hall where her life had shattered. But she had time to decide. For the first time in her life, she had all the time in the world. "No more running," Sebastian murmured, echoing words they'd spoken before, words that had become a promise between them. Isolde turned in his arms, cupping his face in her hands. The mark at his shoulder gleamed silver in the morning light. Her mark, her claim. Her fingers traced it gently, and she felt his shiver of pleasure through the bond. "No more hiding," she agreed. "No more fear." She kissed him, slow and sweet, and felt his love flowing through the bond like sunlight, like warmth, like finally coming home. Below them, the pack stirred awake. Wolves called greetings to each other. Children's laughter rang through the courtyards, and the everyday business of life continued. Above them, the sky blazed with the promise of a new day, a new beginning, a future neither of them had dared to dream of. Luna Queen, the wolves called her now, mate of the Alpha King, savior of her bloodline, the woman who had stood before a hostile court and bled truth until the lies fell away. But to Sebastian, she was simply Isolde, his mate, his love, his home. And in his arms, surrounded by the pack that had become her family, carrying the child that had given her reason to keep fighting, Isolde knew that she had finally found where she belonged.